In this lesson, you'll be taking the functions you created in the last video and actually integrating them into index.js. Remember, the whole point of tracking the users was to make sure we had access to things like the username and room name throughout our other event listeners as well, so we're going to alter these, making sure that they do only emit messages to the correct chat room. We're also going to include users' usernames along with their messages so we can render those to the screen as well. Now, to get started, the first thing we need to do is load those functions in. So up top, I'm going to do just that, and I'll go ahead and grab all four using a little bit of destructuring. We have an object coming back when we require that file. That's ./utils/users. And right here, we're going to get all of them. So we have add user, we have remove user, we have get user, and finally, we have get users in room. So we want to make sure we have access to all four of these functions. Now that we do, we're going to go ahead and edit on join. Right here, the user is indeed joining the room using socket.join. This is where we want to use add user to start keeping track of them. Now, I mentioned that every single connection has a unique ID associated with it, so we're going to learn where that lives as well. Right here, the first thing we're going to do is to try to use that function. I'm going to try to use add user to add the user to that user's array, providing their socket ID, the username, and the room name. Now I'm going to call this providing the options object, setting up ID, username, and room. Now, the only one we don't know how to set is ID. The value for this comes actually on the socket object itself. It is socket.id. That is the unique identifier for that particular connection. Now notice this is in the parent scope for all of our event listeners, which means that inside of send message, I'm going to be able to use get user to get the user by its socket ID. Then I'll have access to their room name and their username, which I can use throughout. And that's exactly what we'll end up doing. Up above, though, we have to finish off this function call. So we have the ID set, then it is the username and the room. Now we know we get back an object with either the error property if something went wrong, or the user property if things went well. Right here, what I'm going to do is destructure that object, storing both in individual variables. So I potentially have an error or I have user, only one. Now down below, we can use a little conditional logic. If the person was not able to successfully join, then we're going to want to notify them of that, saying something like that username's already taken or that they need to provide a username and a room name. Right here, let's go ahead and actually get that done. A little conditional logic will allow us to get this done. We're going to see if there is an error, and if there is, we're going to send that back to the client using an acknowledgement. Now, currently, there is no acknowledgement set up for the join event. So right here, when we emit it, we're not providing a function that's going to run when it's been acknowledged. This is something we're doing for other events we emit, like send location. We provide our acknowledgement function right here. So all we need to do is provide a function as the final argument to emit. This function is going to get called with an error if there is any, otherwise it'll get called with no error, and that's just going to let the client know what exactly is going on. If something does go wrong, the client will be able to use that information to show the message to the user. So over inside of index.js, we now get access to that as the final argument to our event listener function. So right here, I'm going to call this callback. This is the exact same pattern we used for send message right here and for send location down below that. And we call the callback whenever we want to. It's up to us to determine how we're going to use it. Right here, I'm going to call the callback with the error if there is one, letting the client know what exactly went wrong. And I'm going to use return to stop the function execution so none of the code down below runs. I could alternatively not use return and use an else block instead. Either way gets the job done. So at this point, The code down below is only running if the user was indeed added, and we're going to end up doing some stuff pretty similar to what we're already doing right here. We are still going to have them join the room using socket.join. We're still going to emit that welcome message, and down below we are already correctly broadcasting that welcome message, which is great. The only new thing we're going to do is we're going to call that callback function after all of this is complete. So down below, right here, I'm just going to call the callback, letting the client know that they were able to join. Here I'm calling it without any arguments, which means without an error. Down below, I'll remove the comments from the previous video, and there we go. We now have a join event listener that is actually tracking the user. Actually, there is one more change we need to make. Right here, we have username and the room name. Remember that these are going to be trimmed and converted by add user. That means what we really want to do is use the output from add user, the stuff that lives on the user object itself, as that is the correct version. So down below, instead of room, that would be something like user.room, and the same would be true down here for our other instance of room and for our instance of username. So that would be user.username. Now we're just making sure that we use the version that add user is actually storing in our little array of users. Now, with this in place, you could do a bit of restructuring of the arguments. It's really up to you to determine how you want to set things up. So obviously, this approach works fine. As an alternative approach, maybe you don't destructure this first object, and you just call it something like options. Then you could use the REST operator, which we explored earlier in the class, to put all of those on this object alongside of ID. So no longer do we have username and room as variables. Instead, I would use the spread operator, spreading out the options object like this. That would be a fine approach as well. Now, before we can actually test out this functionality, we should probably also clean up the user when they disconnect. Otherwise, those usernames are never going to be cleared out of the user's array, and they'll become unavailable forever. So down below, inside of socket.onDisconnect, we're going to do something similar to what we did above, though instead of using add user, we'll be using remove user. Now, we're still removing them by their ID, that is socket.id, exactly like we had used before, and we know that remove user, which we created, will return one of two things. We either get back the user that was removed as an object, or undefined if no user was removed. So right here, I am removing the user and storing it in a user variable. Now down below, we actually want to use a little conditional logic before sending this message. There's a chance that the person who's disconnecting was never actually part of a room. For example, if they fired off join from the client with invalid data and then saw the error and closed the browser, there would actually be no one who needs to see this message, as they never joined a room and no one needs to be notified. Right here, though, if we do have a user, they were part of a room, so if there is a user, then and only then are we going to send a message saying that the user has left. So I'll cut that out of its current location, put it inside of our if code block, and remove those extra empty lines. Now, from here, we could also choose to include the user's name since we have access to that data. I have user.username and I have user.room. So right here, we're going to go ahead and use the to method to make sure we're only sending this message to folks in the same room. That is io.to, providing the name of the room, user.room. Then we emit the message, and here we're just going to use a template string instead of our current static string. So I'll start off with the username, user.username, followed by a space, and then I could just say something like has left. So Andrew has left or Mike has left. Now with this in place, we are adding users and removing users when we're supposed to, and we can now go ahead and test things out. Make sure to save all of your files, including chat.js, even though we're not doing anything in this callback just yet. And down below, we're going to start up our chat app once again. using npm run dev. I'm going to start up that dev server, and in the Chrome browser, I'll refresh both of those tabs. Now, if you remember, we have two users in different chat rooms. So over here, if I look at the URL, Andrew is in South Philly. Then over here, I have Jess in Center City. Now, in the past, when a user left from any room, every other user was notified, whether or not they were in the same room. With the code we just put in place, that should have been fixed, since we changed the emit event inside of onDisconnect to use that to method, sending it to a specific room. So over here, what I'm going to do is open up a new tab and then close the old one, and we can see that we're not notified over here, which is correct. Then I'll head open to localhost 3000 again. I should have said head over, but head open is a nice shorthand for what I was doing. And right here, we're going to have Jess join the same room Andrew is in. So that would be South Philly. Now, when she joins, I would expect to see the welcome message. And once again, sending those text messages, that's still going to everyone. We'll focus on adjusting that shortly. But this time, when Jess leaves, I would expect to see the message since Jess is in the same room. So I'm going to crack open that new tab and close the old one, and I can see Jess has left is printing. So now that we're tracking users, we're able to use that data to do what we want to do, which is share the events with just people who should be notified, just people in that same room. Now, with this in place, what I want to do to wrap up the video is to actually handle errors that occur on the client. So right here, if there is an error message, that means someone wasn't able to join, maybe the username is already taken, or there's no required data provided, such as the username or room name. In that case, we'll show them a message, and we'll redirect them back to the original page where they typed that information in, so they could try again. If there is an error, then and only then do we want to actually do something, and we'll start by using alert to alert the error message. Now, if you're using a different UI framework, you could also choose to show this error inside of a modal window instead, and then down below, we're just going to redirect them to the home page. Now, for this, we use the location global. Remember, we read off of location.search to get our query string that we parsed. If we want to redirect them, we set location.href equal to, in this case, / to send them to the root of the site, that is the join page. Now let's try to generate an error. I'm going to have two users with the same name join the same room. So over here in Google Chrome, for this first tab, I'll be heading over to localhost 3000. As Andrew, I'm going to join a JS room. Now, this person can join correctly, which is good. Then I'm going to open up localhost 3000 in another tab, and I'll have Andrew join the JS room, and this time it should fail. Right here, we can see our message, username is in use. We click the OK button to accept, and then it redirects us back to this page to try again. I could go ahead and use something like a different name. Let's say I use a nickname followed by JS, and this time I should join, and now I see that join message and they could communicate. So with this in place, we have the very basics of user tracking all set up. We're able to track when a user joins inside of socket.onJoin, and when they leave inside of socket.onDisconnect. Now, we still want to use this information for our other events as well, and we'll focus on doing that in the following videos, so let's go ahead and jump right in.